Hi, we're going to talk about our final method for solving quadratic equations. So if you're given this problem, x squared minus 12x plus 5 equals 0, we're going to go through all the steps. So first, you try to figure out, could I use the square root method? And the answer would be no, because I have this bx term. The next method that I would get to would be factoring. And I would look at these and say, is there a GCF? And the answer is no, there's not a GCF. So then my next step would be, let's look at AC. So A times C is 1 times 5, or 5, and it needs to add to negative 12. Well, things that multiply to 5 would be 1 and 5, or negative 1 and 5, negative 5. And there is nothing right now that adds to negative 12. So this is not factorable. So we know that things are not factorable. We could graph, and we could use the quadratic formula, but we're going to talk about how can you solve this using our final method, completing the square. So what happens when you solve completing the square is we're going to make what we call a perfect square trinomial. And what a perfect square trinomial is it's something like this. So here's an example of a perfect square trinomial. X squared plus 10x plus 25. A perfect square trinomial is something like this one, where you'd have an x, and because it needs to multiply to 25 and add to 10, you'd have a plus 5 and a plus 5. So a perfect square trinomial has the same two factors in here. And so you could actually rewrite this, since it's a number times itself, you could write it like this. So a perfect square trinomial is our goal when we're trying to complete the square. So how do we do that? Well, what we do first is we rewrite this so all the x terms are on the same side. So keep the x and then minus 12x over here, but then we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. After we subtracted 5, we're going to try to create one of these, again, a perfect square trinomial. Trinomial. So what we do is, again, we know our A term is 1, our B term is negative 12, and our C term is 5. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to create a perfect square trinomial. So we look at specifically the B term. And what we do with that B term is we take the B term, we divide it in half, and we square it. And so this is, again, another reason why we call it completing the square. So in our situation, we take negative 12, we divide it by 2, and then we square that problem, or square that answer. So this would be negative 6 squared. So this would give us 36. So what do we do with that 36? We do x squared minus 12x, and we're going to add 36 to both sides of our equation so that it's still balanced. Whenever we do one side, we do the other side. Now, what you should notice is that we've created a perfect square trinomial over here. For example, if I look at this, well, how do I get an x squared? I have an x times an x. How do I get something to multiply to 36 and add to negative 12? Well, then I have to do a negative 6 and a negative 6. And then I'm going to combine this side together and get a positive 31. So what we're doing is, when we complete a square, we're making that perfect square trinomial. So we get the same factor times the same factor. So that allows us, when you have the same number times the same number, it's that number squared. So it allows us to rewrite it like this. Well, now this looks like exactly like the problems we were doing in section 5-6, where we were solving using the square root method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to square root both sides. So x minus 6 equals plus or minus the square root of 31. And then I'm going to add 6 to both sides. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 31 plus 6. Now, typically when we write this answer, we like to put the whole number first, so you'll see it written like this, 6 plus or minus the square root of 31, but our commutative property allows us to write it either way. So our solution for this problem is 6 plus or minus the square root of 31. And if you use the quadratic formula, you would get the same answer. So completing the square is another method for solving quadratic problems.